I didn't think a trip out to nowhere would be the start of something so terrifying. My wife and I just wanted a break, something simple, a few days on the road, away from everything. We were driving down a quiet stretch of road, miles and miles of dense forest on either side, barely another car in sight. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's when the car broke down. Just like that, in the middle of nowhere, without a warning sign or even a noise to hint at what went wrong. The engine died, and I felt that sinking feeling of panic setting in. I tried the ignition a few times, but nothing. Just silence and darkness. "Stay here," I told my wife. She looked at me, clearly as unnerved as I was, but I figured it would be best if she waited in the car. I handed her the flashlight we always kept in the glove compartment. I'd seen a small trail off to the side a mile or two back, and I figured maybe, just maybe, it would lead somewhere. As I started walking down the road, the silence grew heavier. There were no sounds, not even the usual crickets or rustling leaves, and the darkness seemed to press in around me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a dim light in the distance, a village. A sense of relief washed over me, though something about the place seemed odd, almost out of time. It was like stepping into a ghost of the past. I stepped into the village, and immediately everything felt off. The buildings looked ancient, almost like they hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was weathered, some of the paint peeling off, and the signs hanging above the storefronts were written in faded, old-fashioned script. There was this strange, heavy silence, like the whole place was frozen in time. Then, out of nowhere, a man appeared. He was standing in the middle of the street, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from another era. Faded suspenders, a wrinkled button-up, and a hat that looked more at home in an old black and white photo. But he smiled, and I felt a tiny bit of relief. "Evening," he said, his voice quiet and calm. "Looks like you're lost." I explained our situation, telling him about the car breaking down and asking if there was a mechanic in the village. He nodded, and his eyes drifted down the street. "There's an old garage just a ways down," he said, pointing in the direction. "If you hurry, you might catch him before he closes up." He paused then, as if he was weighing something, and added, "You know, this village has been here a long time. Seen a lot of things." There was something strange in his tone, something that didn't quite match the friendly expression he wore. I wanted to ask him more, but before I could, he gave me a nod and started walking down another side street, disappearing into the shadows. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him left me uneasy. Still, I followed his directions, heading toward the old garage. As I walked, I noticed a few other people out on the street. They were all dressed similarly, in clothes that didn't quite belong to this time, each of them moving with this strange, slow rhythm. A couple of them looked right through me, as if I wasn't even there. The further I walked, the stranger it felt. It was like I was the only real person there, surrounded by shadows that only looked human. I kept walking, every step making me feel more like I was drifting into some kind of dream or nightmare. When I reached the garage, I found it shut tight, no lights on inside. It looked abandoned, like no one had set foot there in years. I stood there for a moment, staring at the old, rusty sign barely hanging on the door. A chill crept over me as I realized just how quiet everything was. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since that man in the street. Turning around, I scanned the village, but everything seemed more unsettling in the dark. Then I noticed one of the villagers, an elderly woman, just standing on a porch across the street, staring at me. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just watched me with this hollow look. It was like she was barely there, more like a shadow than a person. That's when it hit me. The eerie silence, the old-fashioned clothes, the way they seemed to move in a trance. These people weren't alive. They were trapped here, or worse, maybe they'd always been here, lingering like echoes of some past life. I remembered that strange man I'd spoken to and realized, with a sick feeling, that I'd probably been talking to a ghost. Panic began to set in, and I turned to leave, quickening my pace back toward the main road. My heart was racing as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But all I saw were those villagers, watching in that haunting silence, their empty eyes tracking my every step. When I finally made it back to the car, I found my wife waiting, her face pale and her hands shaking. She looked at me, and I could tell something had happened to her too. She opened her mouth to speak, but then just shook her head, like she couldn't even put it into words. We didn't wait around. I got in the car, praying it would start. I turned the key, and somehow, the engine sputtered to life. Without a word, we drove off, leaving that cursed village behind. But as we sped down the empty road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really left it. That somehow it had followed us, a piece of that dark place still clinging to us, as if we'd crossed into a nightmare that wasn't ready to let us go. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the steady thump of my heartbeat in my ears. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something from the village trailing us, some dark figure shuffling through the road behind. But all I saw was darkness swallowing the path we'd left behind. My wife finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you see them? The people in that village?" I nodded, still trying to process what I'd seen. "Yeah, they weren't right. I don't think they were alive." The words sounded strange coming out of my mouth, but she didn't laugh or look at me like I was crazy. She just nodded, like she already knew. "I saw one of them while I was waiting for you," she said, her voice trembling. "He came right up to the car window. I thought he was going to ask for something, but he just stared at me, like he was looking right through me. And his eyes, they were empty." A chill ran through me as she described it. The whole experience felt like it had burrowed into our minds, leaving a mark that wouldn't go away. The further we drove, the more it felt like we were carrying something with us, a piece of that haunted village, like it had embedded itself in our memories. Finally, as dawn broke and the first light crept over the horizon, we started to feel a sliver of relief. But even as we pulled up to a small motel, exhausted and desperate for rest, there was this nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I felt like if I closed my eyes, I'd see that man in the street again, or the woman watching from the porch. That night, we lay in the dark motel room, too afraid to sleep. And every time I drifted close, I'd jolt awake, half expecting to find myself back in that village, surrounded by those hollow eyes. We'd escaped, but I knew deep down we'd never really be free. The village was still with us, lingering like a shadow just out of sight, waiting to haunt our dreams, and reminding us that some places, some nightmares, never really let you go. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that the village is still haunting us. We're back home now, back in our normal routine, but everything feels wrong. Every time I close my eyes, I see flashes of that place, the faded signs, the silent figures drifting through the streets, those empty, hollow eyes. Sometimes, I even hear the voice of that man who first greeted me, echoing in my mind, reminding me of things I'd rather forget. My wife and I don't talk about it much anymore. At first, we tried to piece it together, to make sense of what we'd seen, but the more we talked, the more it felt like we were opening a door to something we didn't want to revisit. We became afraid that speaking about it would somehow bring it back, make it real all over again. But the worst part? The nightmares. They started almost immediately after we left the village. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, certain that I was back there, wandering those streets, surrounded by those eerie, silent figures. My wife's having them too. I can see it in her eyes every morning. We're both exhausted, slowly unraveling, trapped in a loop of fear that we can't escape. And lately it's gotten worse. I've started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows where there shouldn't be, movements just on the edge of my vision. I keep convincing myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but then I'll turn, and for a split second, I swear I see someone standing there watching me. The same old clothes, the same vacant expression. Just like in the village. Last night, I woke up and found my wife sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room, her face pale as a ghost. She whispered, "They're here, they followed us." I don't know how to explain it, but I can feel it too. The village isn't just a memory or a nightmare. It's with us, a dark presence clinging to our lives, lurking in every shadow and haunting every quiet moment. It's as if, by crossing into that cursed place, we invited it to stay with us, to haunt us forever. Now, I don't know if we'll ever be free. I'm terrified that one day, we'll wake up and find ourselves back there, trapped in that village, walking among those silent souls, just another pair of lost shadows blending into their ghostly world. And the thought that scares me most, I don't think we'd ever find our way back. The feeling only grew worse after that night. I found myself jumping at every little sound, every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights. It felt like the village was closing in around us, slipping through cracks we couldn't see. My wife barely slept, and when she did, it wasn't long before she'd wake up gasping, eyes wide, looking around like she expected to see someone else in the room. Then, something happened that shook me to my core. I was coming home from work, and as I turned the corner toward our street, I saw a figure standing in front of our house. He wore clothes from another time, old and worn, and he was staring at our front door, his back to me. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. It was impossible, but I knew deep down that he was one of them. I blinked, and in that split second, he vanished like smoke caught in the wind. I stumbled back, struggling to breathe, my mind racing. When I finally found the courage to approach the house, there was no sign of him, no trace that he'd ever been there. But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I told my wife everything, every terrifying detail. She didn't even seem surprised. She looked at me with tired, haunted eyes and said, "They've been coming inside. I see them at night, watching us, waiting." Her voice broke, and I could see the fear in her face. This wasn't just haunting our dreams anymore. It had followed us home, invading our lives. We tried everything to rid ourselves of it. We burned sage, recited prayers, even called a priest. But nothing worked. The village was with us now, woven into our very existence. Every night, we hear whispers in the dark, footsteps that stop just outside our bedroom door. It's as if they're waiting for us to let our guard down, to finally give in and let them pull us back. And now, sometimes, I wonder if maybe we already have. If we're not really here at all, but trapped in that cursed village, caught in a loop, haunted by echoes of our own lives. Part of me is afraid that the nightmare is just beginning, that we'll spend eternity wandering those dark streets, like shadows ourselves, never finding our way out. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. Days? Weeks? Maybe longer. It all feels like a blur now, a fog that I can't shake. I used to think that time would heal us, that we'd wake up one morning and feel normal again. But there's no normal anymore. Not for us. The whispers are constant now. I hear them during the day, too, when I'm alone in the house. Soft voices, like they're just beyond the walls, murmuring things I can't quite make out. When I'm driving, I'll catch glimpses of shadows moving in my peripheral vision, flickers of movement that vanish when I turn my head. I can't escape it, no matter how hard I try. Last night, something happened that made me question everything. I woke up to the sound of my wife calling my name. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Her voice was so faint, almost like it was coming from far away. I blinked into the darkness, trying to make sense of it, but then I heard it again, a whisper, soft but urgent. "Come to me." I didn't think, didn't stop to wonder if it was real. I got out of bed and walked toward the sound. But the house, it didn't feel like my house anymore. It was colder than it should have been, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. As I moved through the hallway, I saw her, standing at the end of it, just out of reach, her back to me. I called her name, but she didn't turn around. There was something wrong, something off about the way she stood there, motionless. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step forward, calling her name again, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't respond, didn't even twitch. And that's when I noticed it. Her shadow. It wasn't the same as hers. It moved differently, like it had a life of its own, twitching and stretching unnaturally. I froze, the air around me growing heavier by the second. The shadow started to move toward me, and before I could react, it leaped out of the darkness, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my wrist. I snapped out of it, yanking my hand back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I looked up, and there was nothing. No shadow. No wife. Just the empty, dark hallway. I ran to our room, and there she was, fast asleep, curled up in bed. I shook her awake, but she was fine, completely unaware of what I had seen. She told me I was dreaming, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I've started to wonder if we're really here at all. If this place is real. Or if maybe we're already gone, trapped somewhere between this world and the next. Every night, I'm pulled deeper into the darkness, and every day, I wonder if I'll ever escape. If we'll ever escape. Maybe we're already in the village. Maybe it's never let us go.